She only wanted a job, but she ended up capturing the heart of a billionaire. When Emma stepped into the Grand Kensington Hotel, she knew she didn't belong. The towering chandeliers, the scent of luxury, it was a world far from her own. Dressed in second-hand clothes, clutching her worn-out purse, she only wanted one thing, a chance to survive. But what she didn't know was that the hotel's powerful CEO, Ryan Lancaster, would soon take notice of her in a way no one else ever had. She tried to stay invisible. He wasn't supposed to see her. Yet every glance, every stolen moment pulled them closer. Until one fateful night, when a secret rooftop meeting changed everything. But can love truly cross the barriers of wealth and status? Or is she just a fleeting moment in his privileged world? Would you risk everything for love? Watch until the end to find out. The moment Emma Brooks stepped into the grand lobby of the Kensington Hotel, she knew she didn't belong. The soaring ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, the scent of fresh-cut roses. It was a world so far removed from her own that she felt like an imposter just breathing the same air. She clutched the straps of her worn purse, painfully aware of how out of place she looked in her second-hand blazer and scuffed flats. But she had no choice. She needed this job desperately. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a woman with sleek blonde hair and an expression that screamed, "You don't belong here," barely looked up from her computer. Emma swallowed her nerves. "I'm here for the housekeeping position. I have an interview with Mrs. Caldwell." The woman's gaze flicked over her, unimpressed. "Take a seat." Emma sat on the edge of a velvet chair, hands clenched in her lap. Around her, wealthy guests strolled through the hotel, their designer luggage wheeled behind them. Their conversations were filled with mentions of private jets and gala invitations. She kept her eyes down, forcing herself to focus. She needed this. She had barely made rent last month, and her savings were gone. The job at Kensington might not be glamorous, but it was steady, and she could use every penny. Minutes passed before a woman in a crisp navy suit approached. "Miss Brooks?" Emma shot to her feet. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Mrs. Caldwell, head of housekeeping. Follow me." She led Emma through the back hallways, explaining the job expectations as they walked. Emma nodded at all the right times, absorbing every word. She could do this. She had worked hard her whole life. It didn't matter if Kensington was the most luxurious hotel in the city. She would prove herself. They entered an office where Mrs. Caldwell gestured for her to sit. "Tell me about your experience." Emma straightened. "I've worked as a cleaner in smaller hotels. I'm a fast learner, and I take pride in my work." Mrs. Caldwell studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We have high standards here, Miss Brooks, but I like your attitude. Trial period for 2 weeks. If you prove yourself, you stay." Relief flooded Emma. "Thank you. You won't regret it." She meant it. She would work harder than anyone. On the top floor of the Kensington, Ryan Lancaster stood by his office window, watching the city skyline. The hotel was his empire, built from his father's old business, and he had turned it into the most exclusive destination in the country. But lately it all felt hollow. His assistant, Mark, entered. "Sir, the board meeting is in 20 minutes. Ryan sighed. "Let me guess. More discussions about expansion?" Mark smirked. "You know them well." Ryan ran a hand through his dark hair. He had everything: fortune, power, a name that commanded respect. But none of it felt like it used to. Mark hesitated. "There's also the upcoming gala. You need a date." Ryan shot him a look. "I don't need a date. You know the press will be watching." Ryan exhaled. He hated the expectations that came with his status. He had no interest in the socialites thrown at him, women who saw his wealth before they saw him. "I'll deal with it later," he muttered. Mark nodded and left. Ryan turned back to the window, unaware that downstairs in the very hotel he owned, someone was about to change everything. Emma's first shift was exhausting. She scrubbed, dusted, changed linens, and made sure every room was pristine. The other housekeepers were nice enough, though some eyed her with skepticism. "You won't last," Carla, a veteran housekeeper, muttered as they finished a suite. "Girls like you think you can handle it, but this place chews people up." Emma met her gaze. "I can handle it." Carla shrugged. "We'll see." Exhausted but determined, Emma pushed through. Late in the afternoon, she was assigned to clean one of the penthouse suites. She had just finished vacuuming when the door opened. She turned, expecting another staff member. Instead, a man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for a year. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his sharp jawline giving him a striking look, and his eyes, intense, calculating, locked onto her. Emma's heart stuttered. Ryan Lancaster. She recognized him immediately. She had seen his face in magazines, heard his name spoken with reverence, the billionaire behind the Kensington, and she had just finished scrubbing his floor. Her stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here." Ryan arched a brow. "Clearly." She grabbed her cleaning supplies, mortified. "I'll just—" "Wait." She froze. Ryan studied her, something flickering in his gaze. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Emma." His lips twitched slightly. "Emma Brooks." He leaned against the pristine white couch, his expression unreadable. "You're new." "Yes, sir." His gaze swept over her, not in the way most men looked at women, but like he was trying to figure her out. She shifted under his scrutiny. "You're not like most of the staff," he said finally. Emma frowned. "I don't know what that means." Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, intrigued. Then, as if dismissing the thought, he straightened. "Carry on." She didn't wait a second longer. She grabbed her supplies and rushed out, heart pounding. As she exited, Ryan watched the door close behind her. He hadn't expected her. And he definitely hadn't expected the way his pulse had quickened when she looked him in the eye. Emma avoided the penthouse floor for the next few days, throwing herself into her work with an intensity that left her exhausted by the time she got home. She scrubbed bathrooms, polished mirrors, and changed linens with practiced efficiency, ignoring the ache in her back and the stiffness in her hands. She wasn't here to make mistakes, especially not the kind that involved locking eyes with the hotel's billionaire owner. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. She was assigned to deliver fresh towels to a VIP suite late one evening. When the elevator doors slid open, revealing Ryan Lancaster standing alone inside, the air shifted. Emma hesitated for only a moment before stepping in, pressing herself against the wall as the doors closed. The space felt impossibly small. She could feel his presence, the quiet weight of his attention, even though he hadn't said a word. The elevator began its descent. She focused on the numbers flashing above the doors, willing the ride to be over. But then, halfway down, the elevator shuddered and jolted to a stop. A soft curse escaped Ryan. He pressed a button on the panel, but nothing happened. Emma's stomach tightened. A crackle came over the intercom. A voice from security informed them the elevator had stalled due to a temporary system issue. Maintenance was on the way, but it could take time. She exhaled slowly. "Of course." Ryan turned his head slightly, studying her. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." She didn't deny it. "I just don't like confined spaces." He leaned against the mirrored wall, arms crossing over his chest. "You've been avoiding me." Her head snapped up. Emma was assigned to a VIP suite late one evening when the elevator doors slid open, revealing Ryan Lancaster standing alone inside. The air shifted. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping in, pressing herself against the wall as the doors closed. The space felt impossibly small. She could feel his presence, the quiet weight of his attention, even though he hadn't said a word. The elevator began its descent. She focused on the numbers flashing above the doors, willing the ride to be over. But then, halfway down, the elevator shuddered and jolted to a stop. A soft curse escaped Ryan. He pressed a button on the panel, but nothing happened. Emma's stomach tightened. A crackle came over the intercom. A voice from security informed them the elevator had stalled due to a temporary system issue. Maintenance was on the way, but it could take time. She exhaled slowly. "Of course." Ryan turned his head slightly, studying her. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." She didn't deny it. "I just don't like confined spaces." He leaned against the mirrored wall, arms crossing over his chest. "You've been avoiding me." Her head snapped up. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was something in the way he said it, like he knew she would deny it but also knew it was true. "I've been working," she said. A slight smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's not a denial. She clenched her jaw. If there was one thing she didn't need, it was drawing attention from the most powerful man in the hotel. "This is just a job to me," she said. "That's all." He studied her for a long moment. "Is it?" Her pulse ticked up. Before she could respond, the elevator jolted, then resumed its descent. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped out without a glance back. But she could feel his eyes on her the entire time. The next morning, Emma arrived early, hoping for a quiet start. But the moment she walked into the staff lounge, hushed whispers caught her attention. "Did you hear?" one of the housekeepers said. "Mr. Lancaster fired 2 executives last night. Just like that. Cold as ice. No warning." Emma frowned. She didn't know much about Ryan Lancaster beyond what the tabloids claimed, but she did know he wasn't a man to be crossed. She shook off the thought and got to work, focusing on her tasks. But her resolve wavered when she was assigned back to the penthouse floor. The moment she stepped inside his suite, she felt a shift in the air. He was there, seated on the sleek couch, reviewing documents. His attention flicked up when she entered. She forced herself to keep moving, gathering the used towels and replacing them with fresh ones. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Emma." She stilled, fingers curling around the fabric in her hands. He rarely used people's names. She knew that much. Slowly she turned. Ryan set his papers aside, watching her with that same quiet intensity. "How long do you plan to pretend you don't notice me?" Her breath caught. This was not a conversation she wanted to have. Not here, not now. She kept her voice level. "I don't know what you mean." His lips pressed into a faint, knowing smile. He didn't believe her. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again. "I'll see you at the gala." Her brows pulled together. "The gala?" He didn't elaborate. Instead, he picked up his papers, dismissing her as easily as he had summoned her attention. Emma left, her heart hammering, her mind racing. The gala was an event for the elite. Billionaires, CEOs, politicians. People who had the kind of wealth she couldn't even fathom. People who were nothing like her. So why did Ryan Lancaster say it like he expected her to be there? Emma tried to convince herself that Ryan's words about the gala meant nothing. Maybe he was just making conversation, or maybe he assumed all staff would be working that night. Either way, she had no business thinking about it. She had a job to keep, and distractions, especially in the form of the hotel's billionaire owner, were dangerous. But when Mrs. Caldwell pulled her aside at the end of her shift, Emma had a sinking feeling she knew what was coming. "You're assigned to the gala tomorrow," Mrs. Caldwell said briskly. "We need extra hands for the VIP section." Emma's stomach twisted. Of course, she nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Understood. The next evening, she was handed a crisp black uniform with a white collar and given strict instructions. No speaking unless addressed, no lingering. Serve the guests, stay invisible, and above all, don't cause a scene. She repeated those rules in her head as she entered the grand ballroom. The space was breathtaking. Towering floral arrangements, glittering chandeliers, and a sea of impeccably dressed guests. Women in designer gowns draped in diamonds. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos. The scent of expensive perfume and champagne filled the air. Emma kept her head down as she moved between the guests, balancing a tray of crystal glasses. She had just placed one on a table when she felt the weight of a gaze on her. She knew before she turned. Ryan stood near the bar, a glass in hand, his expression unreadable. Her pulse jumped. She quickly looked away, forcing herself to focus on her task. But avoiding him wasn't so easy. Emma moved between the guests, balancing a tray of crystal glasses. She had just placed one on a table when she felt the weight of a gaze on her. She knew before she turned. Ryan stood near the bar, a glass in hand, his expression unreadable. Her pulse jumped. She quickly looked away, forcing herself to focus on her task. But avoiding him wasn't so easy. As she moved through the crowd, she caught glimpses of him, speaking with business moguls, nodding at politicians, all while his attention flicked back to her with unsettling consistency. Then as she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a woman in an emerald gown. The woman, a stunning brunette with sharp features, arched a brow. "Watch it." Emma stepped back. "I'm sorry." The woman barely acknowledged the apology before turning toward Ryan, who had approached. "You're late," she told him. her voice smooth. Ryan glanced at her. Something came up. The woman's red lips curved. You're always so mysterious, Ryan. She trailed a hand along his arm, a touch too familiar. Emma turned away, forcing herself not to watch. She had no right to care. But as she moved toward the back of the room, a voice stopped her. Emma? She froze. Ryan stood beside her now, his presence commanding even in the crowded room. She kept her voice steady. Sir. His gaze searched hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. You're working the whole night? She nodded. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but before he could, the brunette from earlier appeared beside him again. There you are, she said, slipping her arm through his. Come, they're waiting for you. Ryan didn't look away from Emma right away, but after a pause, he turned and let the woman lead him away. Emma exhaled, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She reminded herself again that this wasn't her world, and Ryan Lancaster, no matter how many times he looked at her like she was something unexpected, belonged to it. She had no place here, and she never would. The gala lingered in Emma's mind long after it ended. She told herself it didn't matter. The moment in the ballroom, the way Ryan had looked at her, the strange tension that crackled between them. But pretending it was nothing didn't erase the way her heart had raced when he spoke her name. She buried herself in work, avoiding the penthouse floor as much as possible. Yet no matter how hard she tried, the Kensington was his domain, and their paths were destined to cross again. It happened late one evening. She had been assigned to a last-minute turn-down service in one of the private lounges, a secluded space reserved for the hotel's most exclusive guests. She moved quickly, fluffing pillows, dimming the lights, making everything perfect. She had just finished when the door opened. Ryan stepped inside. She stilled, hands tightening around the linens she had just adjusted. He wasn't dressed like the commanding businessman she usually saw. His tie was gone, the top buttons of his shirt undone, his sleeves rolled up. There was a quiet intensity about him, like he had been lost in thought before walking in. Emma turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Stay. She hesitated. He crossed the room, his gaze never leaving hers. You've been avoiding me. She didn't deny it this time. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Why? She met his eyes, forcing herself to keep her voice even. Because this isn't my world. Something flickered in his expression. And you think that matters? She swallowed hard. Doesn't it? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Not to me. Her breath caught. He was too close. The air between them charged with something she couldn't name. She should leave. She should walk away. Remind him that she was staff. That whatever this was couldn't happen. But she couldn't make her feet move. Ryan studied her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key card. He held it out to her. This opens the rooftop garden, he said. It's private. She stared at the card, then at him. His voice softened. Meet me there. Her pulse pounded. She should say no. She took the key. That night, long after the hotel had quieted, Emma slipped through the staff corridors and climbed the private staircase leading to the rooftop. The door opened into a world she never knew existed. A hidden oasis stretched before her, twinkling fairy lights draped between trellises, the scent of jasmine floating in the air. The city skyline sparkled in the distance. But here it was peaceful, secluded. Ryan stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, watching the skyline. He turned when he heard her, his expression unreadable. She stepped forward. This is... She trailed off, struggling for words. His lips tilted slightly. A secret. She ran her fingers over the cool metal of the key card still in her grip. Why did you give this to me? Ryan took a step closer. Because I wanted you to see something that wasn't about power or money. Just this. She exhaled. And what is this? His gaze searched hers. Something I can't ignore. Her heart pounded. He lifted a hand, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She should walk away, say something logical, something safe. Instead, she whispered, I don't understand. Why me? Ryan's jaw tightened. Because you walked into my world and made everything feel different. A breathless silence stretched between them. Then before she could think, before she could stop herself, she closed the distance between them. And for the first time, she let herself fall. The world outside the rooftop garden didn't exist. It was just them. Ryan stood close, closer than he ever had before. The weight of his gaze sent something unfamiliar racing through her. She should have questioned it, should have reminded herself that this was reckless. But she didn't step back. Not when he lifted his hand, fingers hovering near her cheek, as if waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as Ryan's touch lingered, careful, deliberate, as though he knew this was a line neither of them could uncross. For the first time since meeting him, she let herself forget who he was. She let herself forget who she was. But reality crashed back too quickly. A door opened somewhere below, and the distant sound of voices reminded her that this wasn't her world. It wasn't her place. The spell broke. She stepped back, her pulse hammering. Ryan's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He didn't try to stop her. She left without another word, her heart pounding, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The following days were a blur of routine, but nothing about them felt normal. Emma threw herself into work, keeping her head down, avoiding the penthouse floor whenever possible. She told herself that night on the rooftop had been a mistake, a fleeting moment, nothing more. But Ryan wasn't a man who let things go. She felt his presence before she saw him. She had just finished turning down a suite when she turned to find him standing in the doorway. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, his gaze steady, unreadable. She braced herself, forcing her voice to remain even. "Why are you here?" He ignored the question and asked one of his own. "Are you really going to pretend nothing happened?" Her stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. There was no point in pretending anymore. "It was a mistake," she said. His jaw tightened. He didn't believe her. "It doesn't matter what you believe," she added. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "You're not just another person passing through my life. You're different." She shook her head, forcing herself to ignore the way his words made her chest tighten. Different doesn't mean anything. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now but more intense. "Do you really believe that?" She didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know what to believe anymore. Before he could say anything else, she grabbed her supplies and left, ignoring the way her hands trembled. That should have been the end of it. But Ryan wasn't the kind of man who walked away when he wanted something. It started with small things. She'd turn a corner and find him watching her from across the room. Conversations would stop when she entered, as though people knew something she didn't. Then came the whispers. The other staff noticed. She caught glimpses of them exchanging glances when she walked past, heard the hushed murmurs when they thought she wasn't listening. It didn't take long before Carla cornered her in the staff break room. "What's going on between you and Ryan?" Carla asked. "Nothing," Emma replied. Carla didn't believe her. "Men like him don't mix with people like us. Whatever you think is happening, it won't end the way you want." "I'm not thinking anything," Emma said firmly. Carla gave her a knowing look. Emma left before the conversation could go any further. She needed space, but space wasn't something Ryan Lancaster gave easily. She had just finished her shift when she stepped outside the staff entrance. The cool night air, a welcome relief. She had planned on walking home, clearing her head. Then she saw him, leaning against a sleek black car, waiting. She stopped mid-step. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." "I disagree." Her pulse quickened. He opened the car door. "Get in." She hesitated. "If you don't want to, you can walk away," he said. "This is your choice." She should have walked. She got in the car. The city blurred past them in silence. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. "You'll see." Minutes passed, tension thick in the air. She told herself she should have never gotten in the car. Then they stopped. She looked out the window and realized where they were. The rooftop garden. She turned to him, confused. "Why did you bring me back here?" "Because it's the only place I can be myself." She didn't know what to say. He exhaled, looking away for a moment before meeting her eyes again. I've spent my whole life surrounded by wealth, by people who only see my name, my fortune. That's not my problem, she said. You're the first person who's ever looked at me like I'm just a man. Her breath caught. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. I don't care about the rules. I don't care what people think. I want you. She shook her head. Wanting something doesn't make it possible. Sometimes it's the only thing that matters. Silence stretched between them. Then slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. She let him. For the first time, she stopped fighting the inevitable. The rooftop garden felt like another world, suspended above the city, untouched by the chaos below. Ryan's hand was warm against Emma's, his grip firm but not demanding. He was waiting for her to pull away, to say something that would push him back into the untouchable world he belonged to, but she didn't. She wasn't sure when the walls she had built around herself had started to crack, but here, in the quiet of the night, she couldn't pretend anymore. Ryan exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. His fingers tightened slightly around hers, not enough to trap her, just enough to tell her that he wasn't letting this moment slip through his fingers. The stars above them flickered, distant and untouchable. But here, standing so close, she felt the weight of something just as vast pressing between them. Then, as if the air had grown too heavy, Ryan finally spoke. I spent years living a life that felt scripted, surrounded by people who knew my name, but not me. I accepted it as the cost of power, of wealth. She wanted to argue, to remind him that she wasn't the kind of person who changed a man like him, that she was just a girl trying to survive. But the way he looked at her, like she was something rare, something unexpected, made the words catch in her throat. Emma felt the weight of his words settle between them. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she didn't belong in his life that she had never stopped to wonder if he was willing to step into hers. Ryan lifted his free hand, hesitated for the briefest moment, then brushed his fingers lightly against her cheek. The touch was soft, careful, as if he was memorizing the feel of her. She closed her eyes for just a second, letting herself sink into the warmth of it. When she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she had never seen before, unguarded, vulnerable in a way she hadn't thought possible. I'm not asking you to change, he told her. I don't want you to. She wanted to believe him, but the world wasn't that simple. She pulled her hand away, and the loss of warmth was immediate. I need time, she said. He nodded, though she could see the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I'll give you time, he said, but I won't give up. And somehow, that terrified her more than anything else. The following days passed in a blur, but Emma felt the shift in her bones. Ryan hadn't sought her out, and yet she felt him everywhere. His presence lingered in the spaces between moments, in the way her heartbeat quickened whenever she stepped onto the penthouse floor, in the way her thoughts drifted to him when she was alone. She told herself she needed distance, that she had to think clearly. But her heart had already made its choice long before her mind had caught up. And Ryan was waiting. Not pushing, not demanding, simply waiting. And that was what made her decision for her. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped onto the rooftop garden once more. Ryan was already there, standing near the edge, his back to her. This time she didn't hesitate. The sound of her footsteps made him turn, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his expression. Relief. I don't know what this is, she admitted. Neither do I, he said. But I want to find out. She took a step closer. I'm scared. So am I. Then slowly, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment all along, he reached for her again. And this time, she didn't pull away. She let herself fall. And for the first time in her life, falling didn't feel like losing. It felt like coming home. Some love stories weren't meant to fit into neat little boxes. Some weren't written in the stars, but rather carved into the spaces between them. Ryan and Emma weren't supposed to make sense, but they did, and that was enough. It was everything. Ryan and Emma's story is more than just a romance. It reflects a reality many people face today, the fear of stepping outside their comfort zone due to differences in status, background, or self-doubt. In our modern world, many individuals feel limited by their circumstances. believing they don't belong in certain spaces or don't deserve bigger opportunities. But like Emma, we must remember that a person's worth isn't defined by their background or wealth, but by how they live, love, and face challenges. If you've ever felt like you don't belong somewhere, remember that you are the one who decides where you belong. Don't let fear or the opinions of others stop you from pursuing what you truly want. Dare to take a step forward, believe in your own worth, and embrace opportunities when they come your way. If you enjoy heartfelt and meaningful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. Hit the subscribe button now and join us on an unforgettable emotional journey.